She was searching trash barrels for food until an Apache warchief found her and said, "Stay quiet, follow me." What happened next changed both their lives forever. A bond forged not by words, but by the quiet understanding between two souls who had lost everything. The sun had barely crested the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains when Alara Finn found herself elbow-deep in a rotting barrel behind the Silver Spur Saloon. Her fingers, raw and bleeding from weeks of scraping by, sifted through potato peels, spoiled meat, and shattered glass. The stench made her gag, but hunger had long since burned away her pride. She wore a dress that had once been blue, now faded to the color of ash, torn at the hem and stained with the dust of Arizona Territory. Her blonde hair, matted and tangled, hung in limp strands around a face that had aged 10 years in the span of 6 months. Behind her, hidden in the narrow alley between two crumbling adobe buildings, her 2 children waited. Finn, her 7-year-old son, crouched beside a broken crate, his thin arms wrapped around his 4-year-old sister Marin. Their eyes were hollow, their cheeks sunken, their lips cracked from thirst. They didn't cry anymore. Crying required energy they no longer had. Alara's husband, Thomas Finn, had brought them west with promises of land and opportunity. He'd spoken of fertile valleys and a future built on honest work. They'd left Boston in the spring of 1876, joining a wagon train headed for Arizona Territory. Thomas had been a clerk back east, soft-handed and optimistic, certain that the frontier would transform him into the man he'd always dreamed of being. But the land had proven cruel, and Thomas had proven weaker than the desert sun. A fever took him 3 months after they arrived, leaving Alara alone with 2 children, no money, and a town that had no use for widows. She'd tried everything. She'd sewn clothes until her fingers bled, taking in work from the few respectable women who would speak to her. She'd taken in laundry until the well ran dry, and the townspeople accused her of stealing water. She'd begged at the church steps until the preacher, a man with a face like carved granite and a heart to match, told her to move along and find honest work. But there was no honest work for a woman alone, not in Copper Springs. The town was built on mining and cattle, and neither industry had room for a widow with 2 hungry children. Now she searched trash barrels in the pride-on darkness, hoping to find scraps before the town woke and chased her away. Her hands closed around something solid, a half-eaten biscuit wrapped in oil paper, and she pulled it free with a small gasp of relief. It was hard as stone and spotted with mold, but she could cut away the bad parts. It would be enough for the children, at least for today. The sound of boots on gravel made her freeze. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she slowly turned her head. A man stood at the mouth of the alley, silhouetted against the rising sun. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in buckskin and worn leather, with long black hair that fell past his shoulders. Across his chest, he wore a bandolier of ammunition, and at his hip hung a knife with a bone handle. His face was carved from stone, angular and weathered, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw. His eyes were dark, almost black, and they seemed to pierce straight through her. Across his left cheek ran 3 parallel scars, faded but unmistakable, marks of a warrior. This was no ordinary man. This was Kuruk, Warchief of the Chiricahua Apache, a name whispered in fear throughout the territory. Alara's breath caught in her throat. She'd heard the stories. Tales of raids and bloodshed, of settlers found scalped in their homesteads, of wagons burned and livestock driven off into the mountains. The Apache were the terror of the frontier, and this man standing before her was one of their leaders. The townspeople spoke of him with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect, calling him the Bear, a warrior who had fought the cavalry to a standstill more than once. Her instinct screamed at her to run, to grab her children and flee, but her legs refused to move. Fear had turned her bones to water. The biscuit fell from her hands, landing in the dirt with a soft thud. Kuruk stepped forward, his movements silent despite his size. His eyes swept over her, taking in her ragged dress, her bleeding hands, the desperation carved into every line of her face. Then his gaze shifted to the children huddled in the shadows. Finn had pulled Maren closer, trying to make himself a shield between his sister and the stranger. The boy's face was pale with terror, but his jaw was set with a stubborn courage that reminded Elara painfully of Thomas. For a long moment, Keurig said nothing. The air between them crackled with tension, thick as summer lightning. Elara opened her mouth to beg, to plead for her children's lives, but no sound came out. Her throat had closed with fear. "Stay quiet," Keurig said, his voice low and measured, speaking English with only the faintest trace of an accent. "Follow me." He turned and began walking away, not toward the town but toward the desert beyond, where the land stretched endlessly in shades of red and gold. Elara stood frozen, her mind racing. Every instinct told her this was madness, that following an Apache warchief into the wilderness was certain death. The stories flashed through her mind, tales of captives taken and never seen again, of tortures too horrible to speak aloud. But as she looked down at her children, at their hollow eyes and skeletal frames, she realized they were already dying. Slowly, painfully, one hungry day at a time. What did they have to lose? She reached out and took Finn's hand, pulling him to his feet. He lifted Maren into his arms, though he barely had the strength to carry her. The little girl wrapped her thin arms around her brother's neck, her face buried against his shoulder. Together, they followed Keurig into the desert. The town of Copper Springs disappeared behind them, swallowed by distance and dust. No one would miss them. No one would even notice they were gone. Elara had become invisible in Copper Springs, just another piece of human debris to be swept away by the wind. They walked for what felt like hours, though the sun had barely climbed a hand's width into the sky. Keurig moved with the steady, tireless pace of a man born to this land, never looking back to see if they followed. His steps were sure and silent, finding paths through the scrub and cactus that Elara couldn't even see. She stumbled over rocks and through thorny mesquite, her feet blistering in her worn boots, but she didn't stop. Maren whimpered softly in Finn's arms, and the boy's face had gone pale with exhaustion, his steps growing slower and more unsteady, but still they pressed on. The desert stretched endlessly around them, a landscape of harsh beauty that seemed designed to break the human spirit. The sun climbed higher, turning the air to molten brass, and Elara's vision began to swim. Her dress clung to her back with sweat, and her throat felt like sandpaper. She wondered how much farther they could go before they simply collapsed. Finally, Keurig stopped at the base of a rocky outcropping where a cluster of juniper trees provided blessed shade. He gestured for them to sit, then disappeared behind the rocks without a word. Elara collapsed onto the ground, pulling her children close. Her throat was so dry she could barely swallow, and her vision swam with heat and exhaustion. Finn set Maren down gently, and the little girl immediately curled into her mother's lap, too weak even to cry. Elara stroked her daughter's hair with trembling hands, wondering if this was how it would end, if Keurig had led them out here simply to let the desert finish what starvation had started. Perhaps this was his revenge, not quick and bloody, but slow and cruel. But then he returned, carrying a leather water skin that looked worn but well-maintained, and a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He handed the water skin to Elara without a word, his face still unreadable. She stared at it for a moment, unable to believe what she was seeing, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. Then she uncapped it with trembling fingers and lifted it to Maren's lips. The little girl drank greedily, water spilling down her chin, and Elara had to pull it away before she made herself sick. Finn drank next, his eyes closing in relief, then Elara. The water cool and sweet, the most precious thing she'd ever tasted. It was clean, fresh, nothing like the brackish well water in Copper Springs. Keurig unwrapped the cloth bundle, revealing strips of dried meat, dark and well preserved, and a handful of roasted pine nuts. He placed the food on a flat rock between them, then stepped back, watching them with those unreadable dark eyes. Alara hesitated, waiting for the trap, for the demand or the price. Nothing came for free in this world, she'd learned that much. But Kuruk simply stood there, arms crossed, his expression neutral. Slowly, she reached out and took a piece of meat, tearing it in half and giving portions to each child. They ate like starving animals, which she supposed they were. The meat was tough and heavily salted, but it was protein, real food. And Alara felt tears sting her eyes as she watched her children chew. When the food was gone and the water skin nearly empty, Kuruk finally spoke again. "You were in the trash," he said, more statement than question. His voice was deep, resonant, carrying the weight of someone who chose his words carefully. Alara nodded, shame burning her cheeks. She couldn't meet his eyes. "My husband died," she said, her voice hoarse and cracked. "We have no one. No money. The town wants us gone." The words came out flat, emotionless, because she'd said them so many times they'd lost all meaning. Kuruk studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You have children," he said. "You should not be alone." Something in his tone made her look up, and she saw something unexpected in his eyes. Not pity but understanding. The recognition of one survivor looking at another. "Why are you helping us?" Alara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Kuruk was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. He turned his face toward the mountains, his jaw tight, and she saw a muscle working in his cheek. Then he said, "I had a daughter once. She was small like that one." He nodded toward Marin. "Her name was Kaya. She was 5 winters old when the soldiers came." His words were simple, spoken without emotion, but Alara heard the weight behind them. The grief that had been carved into something hard and permanent. "They burned our village. My wife, Aida, tried to save her. They died together in the flames. I was hunting in the mountains. When I returned, there was nothing left but ashes and bodies." He paused, his hands clenching into fists. "That was 3 years ago. Since then, I have killed many soldiers. But it does not bring them back. Nothing brings them back. I'm sorry," Alara said, and meant it. The pain in his voice was so raw, so familiar, that it cut through her own exhaustion and fear. Kuruk looked at her, and for the first time, something shifted in his expression. The mask of the warrior cracked, just for a moment, and she saw the man beneath. A man who had loved and lost, just as she had. "Sorry does not bring them back," he said quietly. "But maybe it keeps others from dying." He stood, brushing dust from his leggings. "There is a place," he said. "In the mountains. My people do not go there anymore. It is sacred ground, but it has been abandoned. There is water shelter. You can stay there." Ilara's heart lurched. "You're giving us a place to live?" she asked, disbelief flooding her voice. Kuruk shook his head. "I do not give. I show. What you do with it is yours. If you survive, you survive. If you do not, the land will take you back." It wasn't a comforting answer, but it was honest. He turned and began walking again, and once more. Ilara and her children followed. They traveled deeper into the wilderness, leaving behind any trace of the world Ilara had known. The land grew rougher, wilder, dotted with saguaro cactus that stood like silent sentinels and rock formations that seemed to defy gravity. The rocks were striped in layers of red, orange, and cream, ancient sediments laid down when this desert had been an ocean floor. Birds of prey circled overhead, their shadows sweeping across the ground like dark omens. In the distance, coyotes called to one another in voices that sounded almost human. It was a landscape that could kill without mercy. Indifferent to human suffering, but in Kuruk's presence, Ilara felt something she hadn't felt in months. Safe. It made no sense. This feeling of security, walking beside a man who could kill her without breaking stride. But there it was. The sun had passed its zenith and begun its slow descent toward the western horizon, when they finally reached a narrow canyon hidden between two towering cliffs. The walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, striated with bands of color that glowed in the afternoon light. A thin stream ran through its center, fed by a spring somewhere deep in the rock. The water burbled over smooth stones, creating a sound that was almost musical after the silence of the desert. Along one wall, beneath an overhang that would provide shelter from both sun and rain, stood the ruins of an old stone structure. It was half collapsed, the roof mostly gone, but the walls were still solid, built from carefully fitted stones that had been shaped by skilled hands. It wasn't much, but to Alara, it looked like a palace. This was a holy place, Kuruk said, his voice softer now, almost reverent. My grandfather's people came here to pray, to seek visions. The spirits spoke here once. Now it is forgotten. The young men do not remember the old ways. He gestured toward the structure. You can live here. The water is clean. There are rabbits, birds, wild onions in the spring. If you are careful, if you are smart, you will survive. He pointed to various features of the canyon, showing her where the best fishing spots were in the stream, where birds nested in the rocks, where edible plants grew. His knowledge was comprehensive, the accumulated wisdom of generations who had lived in harmony with this harsh land. Alara looked at him, tears stinging her eyes. The weight of what he was offering, the sheer improbability of this moment, crashed over her like a wave. Why? She asked again, her voice breaking. Why would you do this for us? We're nothing to you. Worse than nothing, we're the enemy. Kuruk met her gaze, and for a moment, she saw past the Warchief, past the warrior, to the man beneath. A man who carried his own grief like a stone in his chest, who had seen too much death and wanted, just once, to see life triumph. Because I am tired of death, he said quietly. And you are tired of dying. Maybe it is time for something different. He turned to leave, but Alara called after him. Wait, he paused, looking back over his shoulder. Will you come again? She asked, hating the desperate hope in her voice. Kuruk was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face. Then he nodded once. I will come. When the moon is full again. To see if you still live. It wasn't a promise of friendship or protection, but it was something. A thread of connection in a world that had tried to sever all her ties, and with that, he disappeared into the canyon, moving like smoke through stone, his passage so silent she wondered if she'd imagined him. Alara stood there for a long time, her children clinging to her sides, staring at the place where he had vanished. The canyon was utterly silent, except for the musical sound of the stream. Then she turned and looked at the little stone shelter, at the water running cool and clear, at the sky so vast and blue it seemed to swallow the world. Finn tugged at her hand. Mama, he said, his voice small and uncertain. Are we going to be okay? Alara looked down at her son, at his thin face and brave eyes, and felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time since Thomas died, she felt something other than despair. She felt hope, fragile as a bird's egg but real. Yes, she said, surprised to find she meant it. Yes, I think we are. The first week in the canyon felt like learning to breathe underwater. Everything was unfamiliar, dangerous, and required a kind of attention Alara had never needed in her old life. The stone shelter provided protection from the elements, but it was empty, stripped bare by time and abandonment. The walls were solid, mortared with some ancient mixture that had hardened like concrete. But there was no roof beyond the natural overhang, no door, no furniture. Nothing but bare stone and the ghosts of whoever had prayed here generations ago. Alara spent the first day simply exploring, taking inventory of what they had, which was almost nothing. The clothes on their backs, her worn boots, Finn's two small shoes that pinched his growing feet, Marin's bare feet that were already developing calluses. No blankets, no cooking pot, no knife, no tools of any kind. Just 3 human beings in a stream of clean water. She knew they would die without more, but she also knew that for the first time in months, they had a chance. The stream became their lifeline. The water was cold and clear, tasting faintly of minerals but clean, free of the alkali taint that plagued the wells in Copper Springs. Ilara showed the children how to cup their hands and drink properly, how to splash water on their faces and necks to cool down in the brutal afternoon heat. Marin laughed when the cold water touched her skin. A sound so unexpected and pure that Ilara found herself crying, tears mixing with stream water on her cheeks. By the second day, hunger had returned with a vengeance. The dried meat Curic had given them was long gone, and Ilara's stomach cramped with emptiness. She remembered his words about rabbits and birds, but she had no way to catch them, no traps, no weapons. She tried fashioning a snare from threads pulled from her dress, following vague memories of a story her father had once told, but the contraption fell apart the moment she tried to set it. Desperation made her clumsy, and clumsiness made her angry. Then Finn found the wild onions. He'd been exploring the canyon walls, climbing over rocks with the fearless energy of a child who didn't yet understand mortality. When he discovered a patch of green growing in a crevice where water seeped from the stone, he brought one to Ilara, holding it up like a trophy, and she recognized it immediately from the kitchen gardens back east. Wild onions, smaller and more pungent than their cultivated cousins, but edible, nutritious. She hugged her son so hard he squeaked in protest, then showed him how to harvest them properly, leaving the roots intact so they would grow back. That night, they ate raw onions and drank stream water, and it was the best meal Ilara could remember. The onions burned their throats and made their eyes water, but they filled the aching void in their bellies. Marin made faces at the strong taste, but she ate every bite, licking her fingers afterward. They slept huddled together in the stone shelter, using Ilara's dress as a blanket, and for the first time in weeks, no one cried themselves to sleep. The days developed a rhythm. Mornings were for water and foraging, searching the canyon for anything edible. Ilara found wild mustard greens, bitter but nutritious, and clusters of prickly pear cactus that Finn learned to harvest using flat rocks as tools, carefully avoiding the spines. The fruit was sweet and wet, a luxury that seemed impossible in this harsh landscape. Afternoons were too hot for activity, so they retreated to the shelter and rested, conserving energy. Evenings were for bathing in the stream, washing away the day's dust and sweat. And for telling stories, Ilara told her children about Boston, about the brick buildings and cobblestone streets, about the harbor where ships came from all over the world. She told them about their grandparents, dead now, but alive in memory, good people who had worked hard and loved deeply. She told them about their father, softening his failures into something gentler, a man who had dreamed big, even if those dreams had been foolish. Finn listened with solemn attention, but Marin usually fell asleep halfway through, her small body going limp against Ilara's side on the 8th day. Ilara heard footsteps on stone and looked up to find Curic standing at the canyon entrance. Her heart leaped into her throat, a mixture of fear and something else she couldn't quite name. Relief perhaps, or gratitude, or the simple human need to see another adult face. He carried a bundle on his back and a long spear in his hand, moving with that same silent grace that seemed supernatural. "You are still alive," he said. And there might have been approval in his voice, though his face remained impassive. Ilara stood, brushing dust from her skirt, suddenly aware of how she must look. Unwashed hair, sunburned face, dress torn in new places. "We found food," she said, gesturing toward the pile of wild onions and prickly pear fruit. "The children are learning." Curic nodded, then set down his bundle. He unwrapped it to reveal a clay pot, blackened with use but intact, a worn blanket that smelled faintly of smoke, and a knife with a wooden handle. "These are old things," he said. "From before. No one uses them now." It was a gift, though he didn't call it that. Ilara took the knife with trembling hands. It wasn't much. The blade was short, and the edge had been sharpened so many times it was thin as a reed. But it was a tool, a means of survival. "Thank you," she whispered, and the words felt inadequate, too small for what he'd given them. Keurig looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight. "I will show you how to set snares," he said abruptly. "For rabbits. You need meat, especially the boy. He is too thin." They spent the afternoon learning. Keurig showed them how to read animal tracks in the dust, the distinctive hopping pattern of rabbits, the delicate prints of quail. He demonstrated how to construct a proper snare using thin strips of leather he'd brought, creating a loop that would tighten when pulled. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, and Ilara watched closely, memorizing every motion. Finn stood beside her, asking questions in his high, piping voice, and Keurig answered each one with patience that surprised her. "Why do you put it here and not there?" Finn asked, pointing to two spots that looked identical to Ilara. "Because this is part of a run," Keurig explained. "See how the earth is packed down? Rabbits use the same paths every day. They are creatures of habit." He set the snare with careful precision, then stood back. "Check it at dawn. If there is nothing, move it. The rabbit will tell you where it wants to be caught." That evening, Keurig stayed longer than before. He sat outside the shelter as the sun set, sharpening his spear point with a whetstone, the rhythmic scraping sound oddly comforting. Ilara cooked wild onions in the clay pot, boiling them with stream water until they were soft, and the smell made her mouth water. She offered some to Keurig, nervous about the protocol, unsure if such an offer would be seen as presumptuous. But he accepted with a nod. They ate in silence. But it was a comfortable silence, the kind that exists between people who have already said the important things. Marin had fallen asleep in Ilara's lap, and Finn sat close to Keurig, watching the Warchief with undisguised fascination. "You killed soldiers," Finn said suddenly, with the blunt honesty of children. Ilara's heart stopped, but Keurig didn't seem offended. "Yes," he said simply. "Many soldiers. They came to take our land, to kill our people. So we fought back. My papa died," Finn said, his voice small. "But not from fighting. From being sick." Keurig looked at the boy for a long moment. "Death is death," he said finally. "How it comes does not change the grief it leaves." The words hung in the air, profound in their simplicity, and Ilara felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. Here was someone who understood loss, who didn't try to minimize it or cover it with platitudes. "Do you miss them?" Finn asked. "Your daughter and wife?" Keurig's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Ilara thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "Every breath I take, I miss them. But missing them does not mean I stop breathing." He stood, brushing dust from his leggings. "I will come again in 7 days. By then, you should have caught your first rabbit. If you have not, I will show you again." After he left, Ilara lay awake long into the night, staring up at the stars visible through the open roof. The blanket he'd brought smelled of sage and smoke and something else, something distinctly alive. She pulled it closer around her children and herself, feeling its warmth, and wondered about the man who had saved them. A war chief, a killer of soldiers, a man who had lost everything just as she had. The world was stranger than any story she'd been told. The next morning, Finn checked the snare at first light and came running back, shouting with excitement. He'd caught a rabbit, small and lean but real meat. Ilara felt pride surge through her as she showed him how to skin it with the knife Keurig had given them, teaching him the skills her own father had taught her as a girl. The process was messy and difficult, and Finn turned green when blood got on his hands, but he didn't look away. He was learning to survive, They roasted the rabbit over a fire Alara made by striking stones together, a technique that took dozens of attempts before she got a spark. The meat was tough and gamey, but it was protein, real sustenance, and they ate every scrap, even cracking the bones to suck out the marrow.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
That night, their bellies full for the first time in months, they slept deeply, dreamlessly. The days turned into weeks, and the canyon became home. Alara learned to read the land the way Kirik had taught them, understanding which plants were edible and which were poison, where animals came to drink. How to predict the weather by watching the clouds gather over the distant mountains. Her hands, once soft and suited only for sewing, became calloused and strong. She could set a snare, start a fire, skin a rabbit, find water in places that looked bone dry. Finn grew taller, his frame filling out with regular meals, his skin bronzing from constant sun. He became the hunter, checking traps each morning with ritualistic care, learning patience and persistence. Marin, too young to understand how close they'd come to death, simply thrived, her laughter returning like birdsong after winter. She played in the stream, built towers from colored rocks, chased lizards through the canyon with shrieking delight. When Kirik returned 7 days later, he found them changed. Alara met him at the canyon entrance with her head held high, no longer the desperate woman scavenging through trash, but someone who belonged to this place. "We caught 4 rabbits," she told him, unable to keep the pride from her voice. "And Finn found a bird's nest with eggs." Kirik examined the snares they'd set, adjusting one that was positioned poorly, but nodding approval at the others. "You learn quickly," he said, and coming from him, it felt like the highest praise. He brought more gifts that day, a second clay pot, a small bag of cornmeal that must have been precious, and a thick piece of leather that could be used to resole shoes. He also brought news. "The soldiers are moving through the territory," he said, his expression darkening. "They search for my people, to drive us onto reservations. Some of my warriors want to attack the settlements, to strike before we are forced from our land." His voice was heavy with the weight of leadership, of decisions that would mean life or death for his people. "Will you?" Alara asked quietly. "Attack?" Kirik looked toward the horizon, where smoke from Copper Springs was visible as a thin gray line against the sky. "I do not know," he said honestly. "Part of me wants blood for blood, justice for what was taken. But another part is tired, so tired of killing. I have seen too many children die, too many women weep. Maybe there is another way, though I cannot see it yet." They stood together in silence, 2 people from different worlds, brought together by tragedy and survival. Alara felt a kinship with this man that defied explanation, an understanding that went deeper than words. "Thank you," she said finally, "for giving us a chance to live." Kirik looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, she saw him smile, a small, sad expression that transformed his stern features. "You gave yourselves that chance," he said. "I only showed you the door. You walked through it." As the sun set and painted the canyon walls in shades of orange and red, Kirik taught them a new skill, how to make pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries that would keep for months. His hands moved with practiced ease, and Alara watched, learning, adapting, surviving. Finn sat close, absorbing every word, and even Marin paid attention, her small hands trying to mimic the motions. When Kirik finally left that night, disappearing into the darkness like a ghost, Alara stood watching long after he was gone. The canyon felt different now, not just a shelter but a home. The stone walls seemed warmer, the stream sang a more cheerful song, and the stars overhead blazed with a brightness that felt like promise. She had been given a second chance at life, and she would not waste it. Summer pressed down on the canyon like a furnace, turning the air thick and shimmering with heat that rose in visible waves from the stone. Ilara had learned to move with the rhythms of the desert now, working in the cool hours before dawn and after sunset, resting in the shade during the brutal midday when even the lizards disappeared into cracks in the rock. The children had adapted better than she had, their young bodies resilient in ways that amazed her. Finn had become lean and strong, his movements confident as he navigated the canyon's treacherous paths. Marin had developed a fearlessness that sometimes terrified Ilara, climbing rocks that seemed impossibly steep, wading into pools where the current ran swift and cold. Curic's visits had become regular, arriving every 7 to 10 days with gifts that never felt like charity. A coil of rope braided from yucca fiber, a doeskin shirt for Finn, soft and perfectly sized, a pair of moccasins for Marin, decorated with small shells that clicked softly when she walked. Each item was practical, necessary, given without ceremony or expectation of gratitude. But more valuable than the gifts was the knowledge he brought, teaching them skills that transformed them from desperate refugees into something else entirely, survivors, maybe even more than that. One evening in late July, Curic arrived earlier than usual, his face tight with tension. He carried his rifle instead of his usual spear, and his eyes constantly scanned the canyon walls as if expecting attack. Ilara felt her stomach clench with familiar fear. "What's wrong?" she asked, setting down the basket she'd been weaving from willow branches. Curic gestured for her to follow him away from where the children played near the stream. When they were out of earshot, he spoke in a low, urgent voice. "Cavalry patrol came through the foothills yesterday. They found signs of Apache presence, old camps, trails. They are spreading out, searching. Some may come this direction." Ilara's hands went cold despite the heat. "Will they find us?" Curic shook his head. "This canyon is hidden, and they do not know the land as I do. But you must be careful. No fires during the day, the smoke can be seen for miles. Stay away from the canyon entrance. If you hear horses or voices, hide in the cave behind the waterfall. I showed you that place, yes?" Ilara nodded, remembering the narrow opening behind where the stream cascaded over a rock ledge, a space barely large enough for the three of them, but invisible from outside. "How long?" she asked. "How long must we hide?" Curic's expression was grim. "Until they give up and move on. Could be days, could be weeks. I will try to lead them away, make them think all Apache have fled south into Mexico." "That's dangerous," Ilara said, and was surprised by the fear she felt for him, sharp and immediate. Curic met her eyes, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of connection that neither had spoken aloud. "Everything is dangerous now," he said quietly. "The world is changing, and not for the better. My people are being pushed onto reservations, caged like animals. Those who resist are hunted down and killed. I fight because I must, but I know how this story ends. Then why keep fighting?" The question escaped before Ilara could stop it. Curic was silent for a long moment, staring out at the canyon walls painted gold by the setting sun. "Because surrender is death of a different kind," he said finally. "To live on a reservation, to watch my people become shadows of what they were, forbidden to hunt, to practice our ways, to be Apache. That is a slower death than any bullet. At least in fighting, we remain ourselves until the end." Ilara understood that sentiment more than he might guess. She had surrendered once, back in Copper Springs, had let the town's contempt and indifference crush her spirit until she was rummaging through garbage. The woman she'd been then felt like a stranger now. "Be careful," she said, the words inadequate but sincere. Curic's hand moved as if to touch her shoulder, then stopped, hovering in the space between them before falling back to his side. "I will return when it is safe," he promised, then turned and was gone, melting into the twilight like smoke. The next 3 weeks were the longest of Ilara's life. Every sound made her jump, Every bird's cry could have been a signal, every crack of a branch a soldier's footstep. They kept no fire except at night, and even then, only the smallest flames, quickly extinguished. They ate mostly raw food, wild onions and prickly pear fruit, strips of dried rabbit meat from their stores. The children sensed her tension and became quiet, speaking in whispers even when there was no need. Finn took to climbing the canyon walls to watch for approaching danger, perching like a hawk on high rocks where he could see the desert stretching for miles. Maren stayed close to Ilara, her small hand always seeking her mother's. Needing the reassurance of touch, on the 10th day, Finn came scrambling down from his lookout post, eyes wide with alarm. "Mama," he hissed. "Soldiers. 3 of them, maybe 4. They are heading toward the eastern ridge." Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. She grabbed Maren and pulled both children toward the waterfall, splashing through the stream's shallow edge. The cave behind the cascade was cramped and dark, the air thick with moisture and the smell of wet stone. They squeezed inside, Ilara's arms wrapped tight around both children. And waited. She could hear them before she could see them. Men's voices carrying across the canyon, rough and careless with the confidence of armed authority. "Nothing out here but rocks and scorpions," one voice complained. "We're wasting time." Another voice, deeper, with an officer's crisp pronunciation. "We search every canyon as ordered." The savages could be hiding anywhere. The word savages made Ilara flinch. These men would kill Kuruk without hesitation, would probably kill her and her children too if they suspected any association with Apache. The world had gone mad, dividing humanity into categories of acceptable and expendable. Through the thin veil of falling water, she could see shapes moving, blue uniforms against red rock. They were thorough, she had to give them that, checking behind boulders, poking into crevices with their rifle barrels. One soldier walked directly past the waterfall, so close Ilara could have reached out and touched his boot. Maren whimpered softly, and Ilara clamped her hand gently over her daughter's mouth. Her own heart pounding so loud she was certain they would hear it. "Sir." "There's a shelter here," one soldier called. "Stone structure, looks old. Indian work, maybe." Ilara's blood turned to ice. They'd found the dwelling where all their possessions were stored. The clay pots, the blankets, the small collection of tools and food they'd accumulated. Evidence of recent habitation. The officer's voice came closer. "Search it thoroughly. Look for weapons, supplies, any sign of recent use." She heard boots on stone, the sound of their belongings being kicked around, examined. "There's fresh food here, sir," a younger voice reported. "Dried meat, some kind of grain." "Can't be more than a few days old. Fan out," the officer ordered sharply. "They're here, somewhere close. Check every shadow, every cave. Remember, Apache are tricky bastards. They could be anywhere." The soldiers spread out, and Ilara heard them getting closer to the waterfall. Her mind raced through desperate calculations. If they were discovered, she could claim to be a settler, separated from a wagon train, but her association with Apache goods would condemn her. They would assume she was a collaborator, maybe even a captive who'd gone native. Neither scenario ended well. Then from somewhere beyond the canyon, came the sharp crack of a rifle shot. Then another. The soldiers froze, then rushed toward the sound, shouting to each other. "Contact! Contact! Northeast ridge!" Their boots pounded past the waterfall, splashing through the stream, and then they were gone, racing toward what sounded like an engagement. Ilara waited, counting her heartbeats, not daring to move. More shots echoed across the desert, distant but distinct. Someone was drawing the soldiers away. Kuruk, it had to be. He was leading them on a chase, pulling them away from the canyon, away from her and the children, sacrificing his safety for theirs. The realization hit her like a physical blow, and she felt something crack open in her chest, a feeling she'd thought died with Thomas, but was apparently only sleeping. Not love, not yet, but something that could become love if given time and space to grow. They stayed hidden until full dark, until Alara's legs cramped and Marin had cried herself into an exhausted sleep against her shoulder. When they finally emerged, the canyon was empty, silent except for the eternal song of the stream. Their shelter had been ransacked, pots overturned, blankets trampled in the dirt, but nothing had been taken. The soldiers had been more interested in pursuit than plunder. Alara worked through the night, cleaning, restoring order, trying to erase the violation of their space. Finn helped without being asked, his young face serious and determined. They didn't speak about what had happened, but something had changed in him. He'd seen the reality of their situation, understood that the peace they'd found in this canyon was fragile, maintained only by luck and Kurik's protection. Kurik didn't return for 12 days. When he finally appeared, Alara saw immediately that he'd been hurt. He moved stiffly, favoring his left side, and there was a fresh bandage wrapped around his upper arm, dark with dried blood. She rushed to him without thinking, her hands reaching for the wound. "You're injured," she said, her voice sharper than intended, fear manifesting as anger. "It is nothing," Kurik said, but winced when she touched the bandage. The soldiers were persistent. "I had to make the chase convincing. Sit down," Alara ordered, using the same tone she'd used with her children when they'd scraped knees or bumped heads. To her surprise, Kurik obeyed, lowering himself carefully to a flat rock near the stream. She unwrapped the bandage with gentle fingers, revealing a deep gash that ran from shoulder to elbow, the edges ragged and inflamed. "This needs proper cleaning," she said, fetching water and the cleanest cloth she had. It could become infected. As she worked, washing the wound with careful attention, Kurik watched her face. "You were a healer in your old life?" he asked. Alara shook her head. "A mother. We learned to tend wounds, though usually smaller ones than this." "What happened?" Kurik's jaw tightened. "A saber. The officer was skilled, faster than I expected. I was fortunate it was not deeper." He paused, then added quietly, "I killed him. And 2 others. The rest fled back to their fort." Ilara's hands stilled for a moment. 3 men dead because of her, because Kurik had been protecting her family. The weight of that debt pressed down on her shoulders. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "that you had to do that for us." Kurik caught her wrist gently, stopping her ministrations, making her look at him. "I did not do it for duty or obligation," he said, his dark eyes intense. "I did it because I chose to. Because you and your children matter to me. Because in a world full of death and hate, you are something different. Something worth protecting." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Alara felt her breath catch, felt the careful walls she'd built around her heart begin to tremble. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. Kurik released her wrist, looking away toward the darkening sky. "Say nothing. Just live. That is enough." But it wasn't enough, not anymore. Alara finished bandaging his wound with hands that shook slightly, then sat beside him on the rock, their shoulders almost touching. They watched the stars emerge, one by one, diamond bright in the desert sky. "Tell me about her," Alara said softly. "Your daughter, Kaya." Kurik was silent so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice rough with memory, he began to speak. "She was wild like the wind, always running, always laughing. She loved to catch butterflies but would never harm them, just hold them gently and watch their wings move, then let them go. She called me Papa Bear because I would growl and chase her, and she would shriek with delight." His voice cracked slightly. "The last time I saw her, she was angry with me for leaving to hunt. She said I loved the mountains more than I loved her. I told her that was foolish, that I would always come back. But I was wrong." Alara felt tears on her cheeks. "She knew you loved her," she said with certainty. "Children always know." Kurik nodded slowly. "Perhaps, But I will never hear her laugh again, never watch her catch butterflies. That is the grief I carry, not just that she died, but that her life was cut short, that she never grew to be the woman she would have become. Thomas wanted a son, Ilara found herself saying, words she'd never spoken aloud before. When Marin was born, he tried to hide his disappointment, but I saw it. He loved her, I know he did, but some part of him always wished she'd been a boy. And now he's dead, and I'm raising both of them alone. And sometimes I'm so angry at him for dying, for leaving me with this impossible burden. And then I feel guilty for being angry, because he didn't choose to get sick. She laughed, a bitter sound. We're a pair, aren't we? Carrying our dead with us everywhere. Kuruk turned to look at her, and in the starlight, his face was softer than she'd ever seen it. Perhaps that is how we honor them, he said. By carrying them, by letting their memory shape us into better people than we were. My daughter would have wanted me to help you. Your husband, even with his faults, would have wanted you to survive. To give his children a future. His hand moved to cover hers where it rested on the stone between them. Warm and solid and real, they sat that way for a long time. Two broken people finding something whole in each other's company. When Kuruk finally stood to leave, moving carefully because of his injury, Ilara stood with him. Stay, she said impulsively. Just for tonight. You're hurt, you need rest. The shelter is large enough. Kuruk hesitated, clearly torn between propriety and practicality. Finally, he nodded. Just tonight, but as they settled into the stone dwelling, Finn and Marin already asleep on one side, Kuruk on the other, and Ilara in the middle tending the small fire. She wondered if anything would ever be just anything again. The walls between their worlds were crumbling, stone by stone, and she wasn't sure if that terrified her or gave her hope. Perhaps it was both. Autumn came to the canyon with subtle changes that only those who truly watched the land could perceive. The cottonwoods along the stream turned yellow, their leaves fluttering like gold coins in the wind. The air lost its brutal edge, becoming crisp in the mornings and mild during the days. Ilara noticed that the rabbits grew thicker fur, that certain birds disappeared while others arrived, migrating south ahead of winter. The land was preparing, and so was she. Kuruk's visits had changed after the night he'd stayed in the shelter. He came more frequently now, sometimes every 3 or 4 days, and he stayed longer, teaching them skills that went beyond mere survival. He showed Finn how to make arrows, how to fletch them with hawk feathers, and tip them with sharpened stone. He taught Ilara to tan hides properly, stretching and scraping deer skins until they were soft as cloth, explaining that they would need warm clothing when the cold came. He brought Marin a doll made from corn husks, something his own daughter had loved, and watched with something like contentment as the little girl played. But there was tension beneath the surface, a sense of approaching storm that all of them could feel. Kuruk spoke more often of his people's struggles, of how the reservation boundaries were tightening, of young warriors who wanted to fight one last great battle rather than surrender. He talked about a chief named Geronimo who was gathering followers, planning resistance. His voice held admiration but also resignation, as if he knew how the story would end, but couldn't quite bring himself to abandon hope. One cool October morning, Ilara was grinding corn in the stone mortar Kuruk had brought, a meditative task that allowed her mind to wander, when she heard voices from the canyon entrance. Not Kuruk's voice, but multiple speakers, talking in Apache, their tones urgent and argumentative. She looked up to see Kuruk approaching with 3 other warriors, younger men with hard faces and suspicious eyes. Their presence transformed the peaceful canyon into something charged with danger. Kuruk's expression was carefully neutral, but Ilara saw the tension in his shoulders. He spoke to her in English, perhaps so his companions could understand. These are warriors from my band. They need to rest here for a day, maybe 2. There has been trouble. The youngest warrior, who couldn't have been more than 20, spat words in Apache, his tone clearly hostile. Kuruk responded sharply, his voice carrying the authority of leadership, and the young man fell silent, though his eyes remained hot with anger. "What kind of trouble?" Alara asked, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her gut. Kuruk's jaw tightened. "We raided a supply wagon 3 days ago. Food and blankets meant for the reservation, but which would never have reached the people. The army followed us, and we had to split up. These men need to hide until the search moves on." He paused, then added quietly, "I am sorry to bring this to your door, but I have nowhere else." Alara looked at the 3 warriors, saw the exhaustion etched into their faces, the hunger, the desperation of men with nowhere left to run. She thought about refusing, about protecting her children above all else, but then she remembered garbage barrels and the taste of rot, remembered what it felt like to be hunted. "They can stay," she said, "but the children's safety comes first. If there's any threat to them, any at all, you leave immediately." Kuruk translated her words, and the warriors exchanged glances. The hostile young one said something that made the others laugh, not kindly. Kuruk's response was sharp enough to silence them. The next 2 days were tense and strange. The warriors set up a temporary camp at the far end of the canyon, away from the stone shelter but close enough that Alara could always feel their presence. They moved like ghosts, silent and watchful, taking turns standing guard on the high rocks. Finn was fascinated by them, wanting to get closer, to watch them sharpen weapons and speak in their fluid, musical language. Alara forbade it absolutely, keeping both children close. Marin seemed to sense the danger and clung to her mother's skirt. Her earlier fearlessness replaced by instinctive caution. Kuruk spent most of his time with the warriors, planning, arguing, occasionally laughing at some shared joke or memory. But each evening, he came to the shelter, sitting with Alara as the sun set, talking in low voices while the children slept. "They want to go north," he told her on the second night, "to join with Geronimo's band in the Chiricahua Mountains. They believe there will be one final stand, a battle that will force the Americans to respect Apache sovereignty." His voice was heavy with doubt. "And you?" Alara asked. "What do you believe?" Kuruk stared into the small fire, his face illuminated by flickering orange light. "I believe we have already lost. Not because we lack courage or skill, but because there are too many of them and too few of us. They can lose 100 battles and still win the war. We can win 100 battles and still be destroyed." He looked at her directly. "But I cannot abandon my people. Even knowing the end, I cannot simply walk away. Is that what you want to do?" The question was quiet but loaded with implications. "Walk away?" Kuruk's expression became complex, layered with emotions he clearly struggled to articulate. "Part of me wants exactly that. To stay here, in this canyon, to help you build something that lasts. To watch your children grow, to have peace. But I am a war chief. My people look to me for leadership. If I abandon them now, in their darkest hour, what kind of man does that make me?" His voice dropped to a whisper. "What kind of man chooses his own happiness over the survival of his people?" Alara reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses and scars. The strength in those fingers that could kill or create with equal skill. "It makes you human," she said softly. "It makes you someone who has sacrificed enough, bled enough, lost enough. There's no shame in choosing life over death, in choosing to build instead of destroy." Kuruk's fingers tightened around hers. "And if I stay, what then? We live in this canyon forever, hiding from both our peoples? Your people would call you a squaw woman, treat you worse than they already do. My people would call me a traitor, a coward who abandoned them for a white woman's bed." The crude words stung, but Alara didn't flinch. "I don't care what anyone calls me," she said fiercely. "I've been called worse. I've been treated like refuse, like something to be thrown away. At least here I'm alive. My children are alive. That matters more than anyone's opinion." She paused, then added more gently, "But I won't ask you to abandon your people. That decision has to be yours." On the third morning, the decision was taken out of their hands. Finn, who had climbed to his usual lookout post, despite Alara's warnings to stay close, came running back with news that turned her blood to ice. "Soldiers," he gasped. "Lots of them."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Maybe 20, 30. They're coming from the south, moving slow but steady. "Mama, they're searching everything." Kuruk and his warriors were ready to move within minutes, gathering their weapons with the efficiency of men who had done this countless times. The young hostile warrior wanted to stay and fight, arguing passionately in Apache, but Kuruk shut him down with a sharp command. "We fight when we can win," he said in English, perhaps for Ilara's benefit. "This is not that time." He turned to Ilara, his face set and hard. "Take the children to the cave behind the waterfall. Stay there until I come for you, or until a full day has passed with no sounds of battle. If I do not return, wait 3 days, then travel north to the trading post at Dos Cabezas. Tell them you are a widow from a wagon train. They will help you." "No," Ilara said, surprised by the force of her own voice. "You're not going to draw them away again. You're already on their lists, already wanted. If they catch you, they'll hang you." Kuruk's expression softened slightly. "Then I will make sure they do not catch me. But your children need you alive, Ilara. I will not let you risk yourself for me." He gripped her shoulders, his touch gentle despite the urgency. "Promise me you will stay hidden. Promise me you will survive." Before she could respond, he leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers, a gesture of intimacy that transcended words. Then he was gone, the 3 warriors melting into the canyon walls like smoke, leaving Ilara standing alone with her children and a terror so profound it made her shake. She got Finn and Marin into the cave as ordered, the space even more cramped with the supplies she'd hastily gathered: water, food, blankets. Through the veil of falling water, she watched and waited. The morning stretched into afternoon, the sun climbing to its zenith and beginning its descent. She heard nothing, no gunshots, no shouts, only the normal sounds of the desert, wind and water and bird calls. Then, as the sun touched the western ridge, she heard horses. Many horses, moving with military precision. Through the distorted curtain of the waterfall, she could see blue uniforms, at least 30 soldiers spreading through the canyon like a plague. They were thorough, checking every shadow, every crevice. A young lieutenant directed the search, his voice crisp and confident. "Tracks lead into this canyon. They're here somewhere, or were recently. Find them," Marin whimpered, and Ilara clamped her hand gently over her daughter's mouth, making soothing sounds against her ear. Finn pressed against her other side, his body rigid with fear but his eyes alert, watching through the water. Soldiers passed within feet of the waterfall, so close Ilara could hear their conversations. "Nothing but rocks and water," one complained. "Maybe they doubled back." Another responded, "The lieutenant says we search until dark, so we search until dark." One soldier stopped directly in front of the waterfall, staring at it with suspicious eyes. Ilara's heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst. The soldier took a step closer, then another, reaching out as if to push through the cascade. In that moment, Ilara knew they were discovered. Knew that in seconds her children would be exposed to whatever mercy or cruelty these men chose to dispense. Then a shot rang out from the northern ridge, sharp and clear. Then another. The soldiers spun toward the sound, weapons rising. "Contact!" someone shouted. "North Ridge, multiple hostiles." The lieutenant was already mounted, spurring his horse toward the gunfire. "First and second squads with me. Third squad, secure this position." Half the soldiers thundered away, leaving perhaps 10 men behind. And those were focused on the ridge where smoke from rifle fire now rose in thin plumes. The remaining soldiers began constructing a defensive position, using rocks and fallen trees for cover, clearly expecting to be attacked. Their attention was entirely on the ridge, on the threat they could see. None looked at the waterfall. Alara waited, barely breathing. As the sounds of battle echoed across the canyon, rifles cracking, men shouting. The wild war cries of Apache warriors who knew they were making their last stand. The fight lasted perhaps 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. The shooting gradually decreased, became sporadic, then stopped entirely. Alara heard soldiers returning, their voices subdued. "Got 2 of them," someone reported. "The others escaped into the rocks. Lieutenant says we pursue at first light. 2 dead. 2 of the 3 warriors who had sought refuge in this canyon." Alara felt sick, thinking of their faces, their youth, their desperate courage. Were they the ones who died? Or had Kurek fallen on that ridge, buying safety for her and her children with his blood? The soldiers made camp in the canyon that night, building fires that turned the stone walls orange and made hiding impossible. Alara kept her children silent through sheer force of will, whispering stories, singing soundlessly, doing anything to keep them calm. They couldn't leave the cave, couldn't risk the sound of splashing water or the sight of movement. So they stayed, cramped and cold and terrified, while the enemy slept mere yards away. Dawn came with agonizing slowness, gray light seeping into the canyon like dirty water. The soldiers broke camp efficiently, the lieutenant organizing search parties to comb the surrounding area. "I want those savages found," he commanded. "They can't have gone far on foot. Move out." The troops departed in squads, spreading across the desert like a net. When the last horse had disappeared over the ridge and silence had fallen again, Alara waited another hour, counting her heartbeats before finally allowing herself to move. They emerged from the cave stiff and aching, Marin crying softly from hunger and exhaustion. Alara surveyed the canyon, seeing the trampled earth, the abandoned fire pits, the evidence of military occupation. But no sign of Kurek, no indication whether he lived or died. The not knowing was a special kind of torture. She was preparing a small fire, needing to cook something warm for the children, when she heard a sound from the canyon entrance. She spun, ready to grab the children and run, and saw a figure limping toward them. Kurek, alive but clearly injured, supported by the young warrior who had been so hostile. The 3rd warrior was nowhere to be seen. They collapsed near the shelter, and Alara rushed to help, her hands immediately checking for wounds. Kurek had a deep gash across his ribs, still bleeding sluggishly, and his left leg was injured, possibly broken. The young warrior had a bullet wound through his shoulder, but seemed in better shape. "Mateo is dead," Kurek said, his voice rough with pain and grief. "He stayed to draw them off while we escaped. He died singing his death song." Alara worked through the morning, cleaning wounds, binding injuries, forcing water and food into men who wanted only to rest. The young warrior, whose name she learned was Nate, watched her with new respect, his earlier hostility replaced by grudging acceptance. When she finished bandaging Kurek's ribs, he caught her wrist. "You should leave this place," he said. "It is compromised now. The soldiers will remember it, mark it on their maps. You are not safe here anymore. Where would we go?" Alara asked, too exhausted for fear. "Back to Copper Springs? They'd run us out of town, or worse. Further into the desert? We'd die in a week. This canyon is the only home we have." Kurek's eyes were dark with pain and something deeper, the knowledge that he brought danger to the one place that had been safe. "I am sorry," he whispered. "I am so sorry," Alara shook her head, brushing sweat-dampened hair from his forehead with surprising tenderness. "You have nothing to apologize for. You saved us, gave us life when we had none. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Winter arrived with unexpected mercy, bringing cold that was sharp but not cruel, and occasional rains that turned the desert briefly green. Kurik's injuries healed slowly, the broken leg taking weeks before he could walk without limping, the gash across his ribs leaving a scar that would mark him forever. Nate stayed with them through the worst of it, his shoulder wound healing cleaner than expected, and during those long weeks of recovery, something shifted in the young warrior's attitude. He began teaching Finn the proper way to shoot a bow, showing patience the boy's own father had never demonstrated. He carved toys for Marin, small animals that made her laugh with delight. And he stopped looking at Alara with suspicion, replacing it with something like familial acceptance. The canyon had become crowded with 5 people, but it was a comfortable crowding, the kind that comes from shared purpose and mutual respect. They developed routines that felt almost domestic. Alara and Kurik would prepare meals together, their movements synchronized in the way of people who had learned each other's rhythms. Finn and Nate would hunt in the mornings, returning with rabbits or quail, sometimes even a deer that would feed them for weeks. Marin appointed herself the keeper of the fire, carefully tending the flames with a seriousness that made the adults smile. But the world beyond the canyon had not forgotten them. Soldiers still patrolled the territory, and refugees from other Apache bands passed through occasionally, bringing news that grew progressively darker. Geronimo had surrendered in early September, and with him, the last major resistance had crumbled. The remaining Apache were being rounded up and sent to reservations in Florida, far from their homeland, exiled to a land they had never seen. Some warriors chose to flee into Mexico, preferring freedom in a foreign country to imprisonment in their own. Others simply disappeared into the desert, choosing to die as they had lived, on their own terms. One evening in late November, as they sat around the fire after supper, Nate spoke in halting English, still learning the language. "I go soon," he said, his young face serious. "South to Mexico. My cousin is there, with others who will not surrender. They say there's a valley where Apache can live free, away from soldiers and reservations." He looked at Kurik. "You should come. You are still strong, still needed. The fight is not over." Kurik was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. Alara felt her stomach clench, knowing this moment had been approaching, dreading it nonetheless. "The fight is over," Kurik said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of acceptance. "Not because we lack courage, but because the world has changed in ways we cannot change back. Going to Mexico means living as outlaws forever, always running, always hunted. That is not freedom, that is just a slower form of dying." He looked at Nate with something like fatherly affection. "You are young, you still have fire in your blood. But I am tired, nephew. I have fought enough, killed enough, lost enough. I choose to live differently now." Nate's expression showed disappointment, but also understanding. "The elders will say you have gone soft, that a white woman has stolen your warrior spirit." The words were not meant cruelly, just stating an expected reality. Kurik nodded slowly. "Let them say what they wish. I know what I have lost, and what I have found. A warrior spirit that only knows killing is not spirit at all, just emptiness wearing a brave face." He gestured around the canyon. "Here, I have purpose that does not require blood. That is worth more than glory." Nate left 3 days later, taking with him dried meat and one of Kurik's rifles, a parting gift from Warchief to warrior. They watched him climb out of the canyon and disappear into the desert, heading south toward an uncertain future. Finn cried, having grown attached to the young warrior who had treated him like a younger brother. Even Marin was subdued, sensing the loss. That night, the canyon felt emptier despite being less crowded. December brought unexpected visitors of a different sort. A wagon appeared at the canyon entrance, driven by a weathered woman in her 60s with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. Behind her sat 3 children, orphans from a wagon train that had been hit by cholera. Name's Margaret Thornton, the woman announced without preamble. I heard tell there was a white woman living out here in Apache country. Figured it might be true. These young'uns need a place, and I'm too old to care for them proper. Thought maybe you could use the help and they could use the home. Ilara stood speechless, uncertain how this woman had found them, uncertain what to make of this strange proposal. Kirik emerged from the shelter, and Margaret's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't flinch or show fear. So the other rumor's true too, she said matter-of-factly. You're keeping company with an Apache. Well, I've seen stranger things and I'm too tired to judge. These children need food and shelter. Can you provide it or not? The directness of the question cut through Ilara's confusion. She looked at the 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, ages ranging from maybe 5 to 10, all with that particular hollow-eyed look she recognized intimately. Starving, frightened, alone. She thought about refusing, about protecting the fragile peace they'd built, but then she remembered garbage barrels and the taste of desperation. We can provide it, she said. Kirik nodded his agreement, and Margaret's stern face softened into something approaching approval. Margaret stayed for 3 days, helping the new children settle in, teaching Ilara techniques for stretching food supplies and preserving meat through the winter. She asked no questions about Ilara's relationship with Kirik, offered no judgment about their unconventional household. On the morning she left, she pressed a small leather pouch into Ilara's hands. Silver coins, she said quietly. Not much, but enough to buy supplies in Dos Cabezas if you're careful. The shopkeeper there, Samuel Chun, he's Chinese and doesn't give a damn about racial politics. Tell him Margaret sent you. He'll treat you fair. Why are you helping us? Ilara asked, genuinely puzzled. Margaret looked at her with eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. Because decent people are rare enough that when you find them, you help them survive. You took in orphans without hesitation. You're raising children that aren't your blood. That tells me what kind of woman you are. She glanced at Kirik. And any man who would give up war for peace, who would choose protecting over destroying, that's rare too. Don't waste it. With the new children, the canyon transformed again. The 2 girls, Sarah and Rebecca, were sisters who clung to each other with the desperate intensity of survivors. The boy, called simply Jack because he couldn't remember his last name, was quiet and watchful, helping with chores without being asked. Finn took to his role as oldest child with surprising maturity, teaching the others where to find water, how to avoid the sharp cacti, which rocks were safe to climb. Marin, no longer the baby, became fiercely protective of Sarah, the younger girl, sharing her corn husk doll and sleeping curled around her like a protective cat. Ilara and Kirik fell into the role of parents to this makeshift family with a naturalness that surprised them both. They never discussed it, never put words to what they were building, but the shape of it became clear in daily actions. Kirik teaching Jack to make snares while Ilara braided Rebecca's hair. Both of them sitting up with Sarah when nightmares made her cry, taking turns telling stories until she drifted back to sleep. The casual touches between them, his hand on her shoulder as he passed, her fingers brushing his arm when handing him food. Gestures of comfort and connection that had become as natural as breathing. In January, Ilara took the silver coins and made the journey to Dos Cabezas, leaving Kirik with the children. She was terrified, expecting recognition, condemnation, perhaps even arrest. But the trading post was as Margaret had described. Samuel Chun asked no questions, simply traded her silver for flour, salt, coffee, needles and thread, a few precious books for the children to learn reading. When she mentioned she was living in the canyon with an Apache, he merely nodded. A man is a man, he said in careful English. Good or bad has nothing to do with what color his skin is. Come back when you need more supplies. Spring arrived, and with it, a different kind of visitor. A man in his 40s rode into the canyon on a tired horse, wearing the collar of a circuit preacher. He introduced himself as Reverend Joshua Mathis, and his eyes were kind but curious. "I heard about your situation from Margaret Thornton," he said without preamble. "She thought you might appreciate a visit from someone who could offer spiritual counsel without judgment." He looked at the children playing by the stream, at Keurig standing protectively near the shelter. "I can see you've built something remarkable here." Over coffee that evening, Reverend Mathis listened to their story without interruption. Alara found herself telling things she'd never spoken aloud, about Thomas's death, about the garbage barrels, about Keurig finding her at her lowest point. Keurig, in turn, spoke of his daughter, his wife, the burning village, his weariness with war. When they finished, the Reverend was quiet for a long time. "Staring into the fire, the God I serve," he said finally, "cares more about how we treat each other than about the color of our skin or the customs of our birth. What you've built here, this family drawn from loss and pain, this is closer to the kingdom of heaven than most churches I've seen." He looked at them directly. "But you should know, the law won't see it that way. Interracial marriage is illegal in this territory. If anyone wanted to make trouble for you, they could claim you're living in sin, take the children away, maybe even arrest you both." The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples of fear. "What can we do?" Alara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Reverend Mathis considered carefully. "In the eyes of the law, nothing. But in the eyes of God and decent people, you're already married in all the ways that matter. I can perform a ceremony, give you a certificate, though it won't be legal. It might offer some protection, some legitimacy. At least people would know you're committed to each other, not just living in sin as they'd assume." Alara looked at Keurig, suddenly uncertain. They had never discussed marriage, never put formal words to what existed between them. His expression was unreadable in the firelight. Then he reached out and took her hand, his rough palm against hers. "I would be honored," he said simply, "to call you my wife in any language, under any law, recognized or not. You have given me a reason to live when I had forgotten what that felt like." Tears spilled down Alara's cheeks, hot and unexpected. "Yes," she whispered. Yes, they were married the next morning under the cottonwood tree that grew beside the stream, its branches full of new green leaves. Reverend Mathis spoke words about love and commitment, about building a life on faith rather than fear. The children stood witness, Finn holding Marin's hand, the others arrayed in a solemn line. When it came time to exchange vows, Keurig spoke in Apache, then translated. "I promise to protect you and these children with my life. I promise to build rather than destroy. I promise to choose love over hate, hope over despair, every day until I die." Ilara's voice shook as she responded. "I promise to stand beside you against whatever comes. I promise to honor your people and your past while building our future. I promise to love you not despite our differences, but because of them, because they made us who we are." She paused, then added softly, "I promise never to forget that you found me in the darkness and brought me into light." Reverend Mathis pronounced them married in the sight of God, if not the sight of law. And Keurig leaned down to kiss her, gentle and careful, as if she were something precious that might break. The children cheered, and even the canyon seemed to celebrate. Birds singing from the rocks, the stream running musical and clear. Reverend Mathis stayed for 3 days, teaching the children to read from the Bible, counseling Alara and Keurig on the practical aspects of running what was essentially an orphanage in the middle of Apache territory. When he left, he promised to return, to bring more supplies, perhaps more children who needed homes. "You're doing God's work here," he said. "Don't ever forget that." Summer came, then fall, then winter again, and the pattern of life in the canyon deepened into something sustainable, even joyful. More children arrive, brought by Margaret or Reverend Mathis, or sometimes just wandering in on their own, drawn by rumors of a place where orphans could find family. Keurig built additional shelters, expanding the original stone structure into a compound that could house 12 children comfortably. Ilara organized lessons, teaching reading and arithmetic and practical skills. They planted a larger garden, expanded their snares and hunting territories, learned to preserve food for the lean months. The town of Copper Springs, which had once spurned Ilara, began to change its attitude. Families who had lost children to disease or accident heard about the canyon and came to visit, bringing donations of clothes or tools or food. Some came with suspicion, expecting to find something scandalous. But what they found instead was a well-run household, clean children who could read and write. A sense of order and purpose that defied their prejudices. Word spread and the donations increased. Not everyone approved, of course. There were still those who muttered about race mixing, about savage influence on Christian children, about the impropriety of the whole arrangement. But these voices grew quieter as the evidence mounted that the children in the canyon were thriving in ways orphans in conventional institutions rarely did. They were learning skills, developing confidence, becoming productive members of a community that valued each of them. On a spring morning 3 years after that first desperate meeting behind the saloon, Ilara stood at the canyon entrance watching the sunrise paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Kirik came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, and she leaned back against his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong. From the shelter behind them came the sounds of children waking, laughing, arguing over whose turn it was to fetch water. Normal sounds, beautiful sounds. Do you ever regret it? Kirik asked quietly. Choosing this life? Ilara thought about the question seriously, considered the hardships they'd endured, the prejudice they still faced, the uncertainty that would always shadow their existence. Then she thought about the alternative, about garbage barrels and starvation, about dying slowly in a town that saw her as refuse. Not for a single moment, she said. This is real. This matters. We're saving lives, including our own. Kirik's arms tightened around her. I had forgotten, he said, his voice rough with emotion, what it felt like to build something instead of watching things burn. You gave that back to me. You and these children, you are my redemption. We're each other's redemption. Ilara corrected softly. She turned in his arms to face him, seeing the man he'd become, still strong and capable, but gentled by love and purpose. You found me when I was searching trash for food and said, follow me. I followed you into a new life, and you followed me into peace. That's what marriage is, I think. Following each other into becoming better than we were. They stood together as the sun climbed higher, warming the canyon, bringing another day of challenges and joys. Behind them, Finn emerged from the shelter carrying Marin on his back, both of them laughing. The other children followed, a stream of young life flowing into the morning. Samuel Chun's wagon appeared on the ridge, bringing supplies and news from town. Margaret Thornton rode beside him, probably bringing another orphan who needed a home. The canyon that had once been a place of abandonment, a sacred space forgotten by the people who had built it, had become something new. A refuge, yes, but more than that. A testament to the idea that family could be chosen, that love could cross any divide, that two broken people could find each other in the darkness and build something whole. Years later, when people told the story of the canyon, they would speak of it in hushed, respectful tones. The place where an Apache warchief and a starving widow had created a sanctuary for lost children, where dozens of orphans had found family, where the divisions that plagued the territory seemed to matter less than the bonds of shared humanity. Some called it miracle, others called it madness, but those who lived it knew a simpler truth. It was love, fierce and practical and enduring. Love that had started in a moment of desperation behind a saloon and grown into something that changed lives. Love that had taken a woman searching trash barrels and a man tired of death and given them both a reason to choose life. Love that had filled a forgotten canyon with laughter and hope and the sound of children, growing toward futures their parents could barely imagine. And on quiet nights, when the wind moved through the canyon walls and the stars blazed overhead, Alara would sometimes think back to that morning when she'd been caught stealing from garbage. Certain she was about to die, and a stranger had said two simple words that changed everything. "Follow me." She had followed through fear and hardship, through prejudice and danger, through loss and love, all the way to this moment, this life, this family that shouldn't exist, but did anyway. Stubborn and beautiful and real, the desert had tried to kill them both, in different ways and different times. But they had survived, not by becoming harder or colder, but by choosing compassion when the world demanded cruelty. And in surviving, they had created something rare and precious. A place where broken things could heal, where lost children could find home, where a war chief and a widow could build a life that honored both their pasts while embracing an uncertain future. As the sun climbed higher and the day's work began, Alara took one last moment to stand still, to breathe in the morning air, to feel the weight of Curic's hand in hers, and hear the music of children's voices echoing off canyon walls. This was what redemption looked like, not grand or glorious, but daily and difficult and absolutely worth every sacrifice. This was what it meant to be found when you were lost, to be given a second chance when you thought all chances were exhausted, and in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The canyon had transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible just a year ago. What had begun as a desperate refuge for 3 starving souls had become something closer to a small village. A collection of stone and adobe structures arranged in a rough semicircle around the original shelter. 15 children now called this place home, ranging in age from 3 to 14, each one carrying their own story of loss and survival. The garden had expanded to cover nearly an acre, irrigated by a clever system of channels Curic had engineered to divert water from the stream. Rows of corn stood tall and green, flanked by squash vines and bean plants that climbed wooden trellises. Alara had even managed to coax tomatoes and peppers to grow, luxuries that made the children's eyes light up at mealtimes. The compound had developed its own rhythm, its own culture that blended Alara's Eastern upbringing with Curic's Apache traditions in ways that felt natural rather than forced. Children learned to read from books Reverend Mathis brought, but they also learned to track animals and read the desert signs from Curic. They said grace before meals in English, but sometimes in Apache too, honoring both heritages. They celebrated Christmas and Easter, but also marked the Apache ceremonies for harvest and new seasons, understanding that gratitude could take many forms. On this particular morning in late April, the canyon buzzed with unusual energy. Wagons had been arriving since dawn, families from Copper Springs and beyond coming to witness something unprecedented. Word had spread about the school Alara and Curic had built, about the children who could read and write and cipher numbers, who knew practical skills and showed a level of discipline and happiness rarely seen in conventional orphanages. The territorial governor himself had expressed interest, and today was the day he would visit to see if the rumors were true. Alara stood near the main dwelling, smoothing her dress nervously. It was new, sewn from fabric Margaret Thornton had brought, a deep blue that Curic said made her eyes look like mountain lakes. She'd laughed at the poetry coming from a man who'd once been known only as a warrior, but she'd worn the dress anyway. Her hair, no longer the tangled mess it had been, was pinned up properly, though a few blonde strands had already escaped in the morning heat. She looked, she hoped, like someone respectable, someone who could be trusted with children's lives. Curic emerged from the schoolhouse they'd built, a long adobe structure with a roof of wooden beams and packed earth. He wore clothes that straddled 2 worlds, buckskin pants but a cotton shirt Margaret had altered to fit his broad shoulders, his long hair bound back with a leather cord. He still wore his knife, but he'd left the rifle inside, a concession to the sensibilities of their visitors. His face was calm, but Alara could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned the canyon entrance. He was prepared for this to go wrong, for the authorities to decide their arrangement was improper and take the children away. "They're coming," Finn called from his lookout post. Now a proper platform built into the canyon wall with a ladder for easy access. The boy had grown tall and lean, his voice beginning to deepen, hovering on the edge of manhood. He scrambled down with practiced ease and ran to join the others as they assembled in front of the schoolhouse, freshly scrubbed and dressed in their best clothes, ready to demonstrate what they'd learned. The governor's party consisted of 5 wagons and a dozen mounted soldiers, an impressive show of authority that made several of the younger children shrink back in fear. The soldiers bore too strong a resemblance to the men who had raided the canyon years ago, men who had brought violence and terror. Kuruk moved to stand beside Alara, his presence a silent promise of protection, and she felt some of her nervousness ease. Whatever happened, they would face it together. Governor Edmund Ross dismounted from his wagon with the stiff movements of a man more accustomed to offices than frontier travel. He was in his early 50s, gray-haired and dignified, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Behind him came his secretary, a thin young man laden with papers and ledgers, and his wife, a formidable woman named Catherine, who surveyed the canyon with the critical gaze of someone used to finding fault. Also in the party was Samuel Chun from the trading post, included as a witness specifically, because he'd been providing supplies and could testify to the operation's legitimacy. "Mrs. Finn," the governor said, approaching with his hand extended. He'd done his research, knew to use her married name even though the marriage wasn't legally recognized. "And Mr. Kuruk, thank you for agreeing to this visit. I've heard remarkable things about what you've accomplished here." His handshake was firm, professional, but his eyes kept drifting to the children assembled behind them. "Assessing, calculating, Governor Ross," Alara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Welcome to our home. These are our children." She gestured to the assembled group, and on cue, they spoke in unison, a greeting they'd practiced. "Good morning, Governor. Welcome to Canyon Springs." The name had been Marin's idea, simple and descriptive, and it had stuck. The governor's eyebrows rose slightly, impressed despite himself. "Well trained," he observed. His wife moved closer, examining the children with a scrutiny that made Alara's protective instincts flare. Catherine Ross looked at their clothes, their hair, their fingernails, checking for signs of neglect or abuse. After a thorough inspection, she nodded once to her husband, a signal that whatever she'd been looking for, she hadn't found it. "Perhaps you'd like to see the schoolhouse," Kuruk suggested, his English clear and formal. He'd been practicing for weeks, determined not to give anyone ammunition to use against them. The governor nodded, and they led the party on a tour of the compound. The schoolhouse interior was simple but functional. Wooden benches arranged in rows facing a slateboard Reverend Mathis had donated. Books lined shelves along one wall, a precious library accumulated through donations and careful purchases. The children's work hung on the walls. Arithmetic problems solved correctly, essays written in careful script, drawings that showed developing artistic skill. Governor Ross picked up one of the essays, reading aloud. "The Canyon," by Rebecca Thornton. "Before I came to the canyon, I was alone. My parents died and I had nowhere to go. I was scared all the time. But then Mrs. Alara and Mr. Kuruk took me in. They gave me food and a bed and taught me to read. Now I have brothers and sisters. Now I have a home. I am not scared anymore." He set the paper down carefully. "How old is Rebecca?" he asked. 10, Ilara answered. "She and her sister arrived 2 years ago. When she came, she couldn't read or write at all. Now she's one of our best students." Rebecca herself stood straighter at the praise, her young face glowing with pride. The governor moved through the schoolhouse, asking questions, testing the children's knowledge. He had young Jack solve arithmetic problems on the slate board. He asked Sarah to read from a primer. He questioned the older boys about geography and history, clearly expecting them to fail. But they didn't fail. They answered confidently, demonstrating knowledge that would have been respectable in any Eastern school. Outside, they toured the garden, the workshops where children learned carpentry and weaving, the stable where they kept 3 horses and a mule, purchased with money from selling surplus vegetables and crafts in town. Keurig explained the irrigation system, the crop rotation schedule, the plans for expanding production. The secretary scribbled notes furiously, documenting everything. Governor Ross's expression remained neutral, giving nothing away, but his wife had begun to look thoughtful rather than critical. "I'd like to speak with some of the children," Catherine Ross announced. Privately, without supervision. It was a test, clearly, checking to see if the children had been coached to hide abuse or mistreatment. Elara's heart hammered, but she nodded agreement. Catherine took 3 children, including Finn and Rebecca, to sit under the cottonwood tree by the stream, far enough away that their conversation couldn't be overheard. While they talked, the governor addressed Elara and Keurig directly. "I'll be frank with you. When I first heard about this situation, I was skeptical. A white woman and an Apache man, living together, raising children of various backgrounds in the middle of nowhere. It seemed like a recipe for disaster, possibly something that needed to be shut down for the children's protection." He paused, looking around the canyon with an expression that had shifted from critical to contemplative. "But what I see here challenges my assumptions. These children are healthy, educated, and apparently happy. That's more than I can say for most institutions I've inspected. We love them," Elara said simply. "Every single one of them. We don't see orphans or burdens. We see children who deserve a chance at life." Keurig added quietly, "In my culture, children belong to the whole tribe, not just their birth parents. We raise them together, teach them together. What we do here is not strange to me, only to those who think family must look a certain way." The governor nodded slowly. "The law says your marriage isn't valid. The law says mixing races is wrong. The law says many things, Mrs. Finn, but I've been in politics long enough to know that laws don't always serve justice. And justice doesn't always follow laws." He looked at them with something approaching respect. "What you've built here is just, even if it isn't strictly legal." "That matters," Catherine Ross returned with the children, her expression unreadable. She conferred quietly with her husband while Elara held her breath, waiting for judgment. Finally, the governor spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Based on what I've observed today, I see no reason for territorial intervention. Canyon Springs will be officially recognized as a private educational institution, entitled to the same protections and support as any church-run orphanage." The relief that flooded through Elara was so intense she swayed, and Keurig's hand caught her elbow. Steadying her, however, the governor continued. And Elara's relief turned back to anxiety. "There are conditions. You must maintain educational standards, which means quarterly inspections to ensure the children are progressing appropriately. You must keep detailed records of each child's background and placement. And you must be prepared to defend this institution politically, because there will be opposition. Not everyone shares my pragmatic view of your arrangement." He softened slightly. "But you'll have allies too. My wife has decided to champion your cause, and when Catherine Ross decides something is worth fighting for, it generally happens." Catherine Ross smiled for the first time, transforming her severe features into something almost warm. "I was an orphan myself," she said quietly, "raised in an institution that cared more about appearances than children. What you're doing here, it's what should be done everywhere. I intend to make sure you have the resources to continue." She gestured to the secretary. "We're establishing a territorial fund for educational initiatives." Canyon Springs will be its first recipient. Expect a donation of $500 within the month and more to follow. The number was staggering, more money than Alara had seen in her entire life. $500 could buy supplies for years, could expand the compound, could ensure the children had everything they needed. She found herself blinking back tears, overwhelmed by the unexpected support. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means." The governor's party stayed for lunch, eating simple but plentiful food prepared by the older children under Alara's supervision. Stew made from rabbit and vegetables, fresh bread baked in the outdoor oven Keurig had built, water sweetened with honey from wild bees. The meal was accompanied by conversation that felt almost normal. The governor asking about individual children's stories. Catherine discussing educational techniques with Alara. The secretary taking more notes that would become part of the official record as they prepared to leave in the afternoon. Young Marin approached Catherine Ross shyly, holding something behind her back. "Ma'am," she said, her voice small but clear. "I made this for you." She produced a small doll woven from corn husks, decorated with bits of colored thread and tiny shell beads. It was beautiful in its simplicity, a child's gift given with pure intention. Catherine took it with hands that trembled slightly, and Alara saw tears glisten in the older woman's eyes. "Thank you, dear," Catherine said, kneeling to Marin's level. "I shall treasure this always." She looked at Alara over Marin's head, and in that moment, they understood each other perfectly. Both women who had known hardship, who had survived, who had found purpose in protecting children. An alliance had been forged that would outlast politics and prejudice. After the wagons departed, leaving dust trails that slowly settled in the still air, the canyon erupted in celebration. The children ran wild, releasing the tension they'd been holding all day, splashing in the stream and climbing rocks with abandon. The older ones built up the fire and started an impromptu feast from the leftovers, adding roasted corn and wild onions to the stew. Someone produced a harmonica, and music filled the canyon. Simple melodies that made feet tap and spirits lift. Alara found Keurig standing apart from the celebration, staring at the canyon walls painted orange by the setting sun. She came to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his. "We did it," she said softly. "We're safe now, official." Keurig squeezed her hand, but his expression remained troubled. "For now," he said. "But governors change, laws change, public opinion changes. We cannot become complacent, I know," Alara acknowledged. "But tonight, can we just celebrate? Can we just be grateful for this moment?" Keurig looked down at her, his stern features softening. "You are right. I spend too much time preparing for battles that may never come." He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Tonight, we celebrate. Tomorrow, we build stronger. But tonight, we rest in this victory." They rejoined the celebration, dancing awkwardly to the harmonica's tune, Keurig's movements stiff and unpracticed but earnest. The children laughed at their clumsy attempts, but it was loving laughter, the kind that binds families together. Finn swung Marin around until she shrieked with delight. Rebecca and Sarah linked arms and spun in dizzy circles. Even Jack, usually so serious, allowed himself to smile, to be young, to feel joy without reservation, as darkness fell and the stars emerged like promises in the velvet sky. They gathered around the fire for the nightly ritual of stories. Usually, Alara told tales from books or her childhood memories. Tonight, Keurig spoke instead, his deep voice carrying across the canyon, telling a story from Apache tradition about the creation of stars. Long ago, first woman gathered light from the sacred fire and threw it into the sky, creating the stars. Each one represents a prayer, a hope for the future. When you look up at night, you see the dreams of all who came before us, watching over us, guiding us forward. The children listened with rapt attention, faces illuminated by firelight, eyes reflecting stars. In that moment, Ilara saw clearly what they had built, not just structures and gardens, but something more profound. A place where different traditions could coexist, where children could learn that the world was larger and more beautiful than any single perspective could capture. A place where love mattered more than law, where family was defined by choice rather than blood. Later, after the children had been settled into their beds and the canyon had grown quiet, except for the eternal song of the stream, Ilara and Kirik sat together outside their dwelling. A year ago, such peace would have seemed impossible. A year ago, they were still fighting for survival, still uncertain if they would be allowed to keep what they'd built. Now, with official recognition and powerful allies, the future looked different. Not easy, never easy, but possible. Do you ever think about Kaya? Ilara asked softly, naming the daughter he had lost. Do you think she would approve of what you're doing? Kirik was quiet for a long moment, his face turned toward the stars. I think about her every day, he said finally. And yes, I believe she would approve. She had a generous heart, my Kaya. She would have loved having so many brothers and sisters. She would have taught them to catch butterflies and watch clouds. His voice grew thick. I cannot bring her back, cannot change what happened. But I can honor her memory by protecting these children, by giving them the life she was denied. She would be proud of you, Ilara said with certainty. And so would Aida. You haven't forgotten them by choosing to live again. You've remembered them in the best possible way, by becoming someone who creates life instead of taking it. Kirik pulled her closer, and they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the desert. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and another answered. The wind moved through the cottonwood leaves with a sound like whispering. The stream continued its endless conversation with stone. I need to tell you something, Kirik said. Eventually, his tone serious enough to make Ilara straighten and look at him. I received word from Nate last month. A message passed through traders. He wanted me to know that he is alive, living in the Sierra Madre with others who refused reservation life. He asked if I regretted my choice, staying here instead of fighting. Kirik paused, choosing his words carefully. I sent a message back. I told him that I fought for 30 years, that I killed many men and watched many friends die. I told him that I finally understand what we were really fighting for, not just land or freedom to roam, but the right to live as we choose, to practice our ways, to pass our culture to the next generation. He gestured toward the sleeping compound. I told him I am still fighting, but with different weapons. With love instead of hate, with building instead of destroying. And I told him that I have finally found peace. Ilara felt tears slide down her cheeks, moved by the profound simplicity of his words. Do you think he understood? Kirik smiled slightly. He said I had gone soft, that a white woman had stolen my warrior spirit. Then he said that maybe soft was not the same as weak, that maybe I had found a kind of courage he did not possess. He wished me well, my nephew. That was enough. They sat together until the fire burned down to embers and the moon climbed high overhead, painting the canyon in shades of silver and shadow. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more children who needed homes, inspections to prepare for, lessons to teach, gardens to tend. The work would never truly be finished. But tonight, beneath a sky full of prayers made visible, two people who had found each other in the darkest circumstances allowed themselves to rest in gratitude. Ilara thought back to that morning behind the saloon, to garbage barrels and desperation, to the moment when a stranger had appeared and changed everything with two simple words. Follow me. She had followed through fear and uncertainty, through prejudice and danger, through loss and love, all the way to this moment. And the journey had transformed her from a woman searching trash for survival into someone who gave others the chance to thrive. Thank you, she whispered to Kirik, knowing the words were inadequate, but saying them anyway. For finding me, for seeing something worth saving when I couldn't see it myself. Keurig turned to look at her, his dark eyes reflecting starlight. You saved yourself, he said gently. I only showed you the path. You had the courage to walk it. He touched her face tenderly. And you saved me too, though you may not know it. You gave me a reason to believe that redemption was possible, that a man known only for war could become something different. As they finally retreated to their dwelling, Alara took one last look at the canyon that had become home to so many. The stone structure stood solid and permanent, promising shelter and safety. The garden stretched dark and fertile, promising sustenance. And in the sleeping compound, 15 children dreamed whatever dreams children dream, each one a testament to the radical idea that love could overcome any obstacle, that family could be chosen, that two people from different worlds could build something beautiful from the ruins of their pasts. The wind moved through the canyon one more time, carrying with it the scent of sage and wood smoke, of growing things and clean water, of possibilities yet unrealized. And if anyone had been listening carefully, they might have heard it whisper the same words Margaret Thornton had spoken a year ago, words that had proven prophetic. Decent people are rare enough that when you find them, you help them survive. Canyon Springs had survived, and more than survived. It had become a beacon, proof that in a world often divided by hate and prejudice, love could still triumph. Not easily, not without cost, but triumphantly nonetheless. And that was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth passing down to the children who would grow up to build their own futures on the foundation of courage and compassion laid by a starving widow and a weary warrior who had chosen each other when the world said they shouldn't. The desert night deepened, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and in a hidden canyon in Arizona territory, 15 children and 2 unlikely parents slept safe and sound, wrapped in peace they had earned through sacrifice and sealed with love that would endure.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.